right now. We will be making this presentation available on our website after. We are recording most of our NFI presentations, so they're available on our website. So it'll probably be posted in a day or so. And if anyone wasn't able to watch it live, you can watch it there. I think that's it for my housekeeping, Jen. Give me a thumbs up if you're ready to go. Oh, big thumbs up. Well, this is a bi-location Zoom. This is not just virtual. We are actually in two places, and I am going to take you live down to the Wine and Orchard Museum in the beautiful Laurel building where Jen Garner is waiting.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'm Jen Garner. I am the head of programming for Kelowna Museums, and I am inside the newly redesigned Okanagan Wine and Orchard Museum inside the Laurel Packing House. And before we get started on our session tonight, I would like to gratefully acknowledge that the land that we are on, the land where we live, work, play, and learn, is the traditional unceded territory of the Sioux people. And as Gord mentioned, we are talking about agriculture today. And I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge and respect the land management of the Sioux people for approximately 11,500 years. They actively managed their territory. And a couple examples I wanted to share with you was the purposeful redistribution of berries to encourage fresh berry growth in the spring. The Sioux people also regularly, every 3 years, did prescribed burning to clean the forest floor, to promote new growth, and to ensure that they didn't have large-scale wildfires. As we come into the story of the Casorsos that we're going to hear about today, a wonderful entrepreneurial and pioneering family, we'll hear about a different style of agriculture and how they worked this land for 140 almost years. So the special guests that we have with us today in the museum, we have Don Rampone standing up behind me there, and we have Rob Casorso, who's going to be sharing the story of his family. So without further ado, let's get started. Rob, thanks so much for being here tonight.
Thank you for the opportunity.
This is going to be fun.
Yes.
So Rob, your great-grandfather, oh.
Jen, just we've got the video, and then we'll go to the interview. Sorry,
Gord, go ahead.
No worries. Many of you may know that we, with the Italian Club, have a legacy project that includes videos. And the next video we're actually working on in that story, or in that series, is about the Casorso family. So we've, over the last 6 months, have been shooting a lot of video in various places in the Valley. And tonight we're going to be sharing just a couple of very quick, small clips of what we've been working on. And I want to start with the first of those videos. So let me just bring that to you. And this is just a short little video. We'll watch this, and then we'll go back to Jen.
They started with 160 acres that they had to clear. He didn't know how to farm. He started with a few pigs, worked for Father Pandozzi. And, you know, by 1925, great-grandpa and his 8 sons owned 35,000 acres, 4 meat stores, you know, Kelowna, Penticton, Vernon, Kamloops, 350,000 acres of rangeland. I mean, that doesn't come by accident. So, as the generations go down, a lot have sold off, but because this is the original, it's kind of like, it's our obligation to keep it going. Yeah, it means so much, like, I can't imagine, right? You feel privileged.
All right, back to you, Jen.
Okay, thanks, Gord. That's a perfect introductory video as we start talking to Rob Casorso. So Rob, your great-grandfather, Giovanni Casorso, came to the Okanagan Mission in 1883. Can you tell us a bit about how he came here and why?
Well, in Italy, where he came from, in Tonco, in the Piedmont, in the Alessandria, province of Alessandria, in northern Italy, it was going through tough times. There was a bit of a depression, there was a drought, there was threat of political upheaval. And I'd like to think he heard of land opportunity in North America. He had a young family, he had 3 small children at the time. But I think he was always adventuresome. He was the oldest of 12, I believe, 12 kids. And so he decided with his friend, Paul Gaschetti, they left in late 1882 for the New World to see, to find some new opportunity. So they, according to the records, they arrived in New York, March 8th, 1883, and eventually made their way. You know, they worked for a time in New York, then they made it enough money to get to San Francisco. Then they heard about Vancouver. So they went up again, following the promise of land opportunity. And they end up in Vancouver. Not much work was available except in the logging industry at the time, which was tough work. And they ran into an oblate priest who was connected with Father Pandozzi at Okanagan Mission. His name was Father Cacola, who then introduced Giovanni and Paul Gaschetti to Father Pandozzi. They explained to them how they were opening up the valley to agriculture, ranching and different types of farming, and wondered if, you know, it kind of encouraged them to come in. So it was that, so they decided they would. I think their eyes were opened on that first 2-week journey to the Okanagan with Father Pandozzi over the roughest trails, you know, crazy rivers, you know, dealing with country they've never really dealt with before, animals they'd never seen before. So, but eventually when they came to the valley, it was just like home back in Terra. And that's when he decided to set up shop.
Wow, it sounds like an unbelievable journey just to start off.
Yes.
Can you tell us a bit about what it was like when he first came here?
Well, again, it was nothing like home. So there's only about 20 white families here at the time. Most of them were First Nations, the Salish, and Father Pandozzi had a really good relationship with them. It wasn't so much so in the United States, but he had set up a really good foundation in the valley. And one thing he always taught my great-grandfather Giovanni at the time is he said, learn from everything, learn from everybody, because they can teach you what you need to know as much as I can. And yeah, so it was raw. He first got 2 acres to work with on the south side of Mission Creek, where the homestead is now. And he had to get to work and build himself a little home. He got a garden going, but he worked for Father Pandozzi, basically taking cattle and different animals up and down the valley to different places and stuff like that, Kamloops and stuff. So that first year was pretty rough. And the winter shook him up a bit too. So
Right, the first Canadian winter.
yes.
Now, your great-grandmother, Rosa,
Yes.
came with 3 children a couple years later in 1884 to join her husband, Giovanni.
Yes.
Can you tell us a bit about Rosa's journey?
Rosa's journey was exceptional. You know, like when Giovanni left, he left her with 3 young children. And she came from a poor family. Like, so, you know, when they first were married, it was kind of like taboo because the Casorsos were a little more wealthy and she came from a poorer family. But anyway, there was something about it that he just loved. And so anyway, she got the letter from Giovanni. He had enough money together, sent her some money to come to Canada. It was time to come. And so she got fare. She got on her ship. She ended up getting to New York. But then the next ship they took had to go around the southern tip of South America and back up, right?
There was no Panama Canal. yet.
There's no Panama Canal, so she was 6 weeks on a ship with 3 little kids, and not knowing any English, she ended up in San Francisco on the docks, didn't speak any English, and all she had was this letter from Giovanni Casorso, Okanagan Mission. And a dockhand came up to her. She couldn't understand it, but all she pointed to was her letter. And he said, well, there's a crate over here. And it said Father Pandozzi, Okanagan Mission, BC. And it was the church bell, which hangs at Immaculate Conception in Kelowna. And
Just on Sutherland Road,
on
just
Sutherland,
outside of downtown.
yes. So it was purchased by Joseph Christian for $500. It was made in France and shipped over. But just the chance that it was on the dock at the same time she showed up. So she followed that crate from San Francisco to Vancouver and wagon trained it in with 3 little kids. And when she had arrived in Kelowna, Giovanni wasn't in the home. So he was up hunting or doing work up in the bush. So the Oblate priest, they set her up in his home and stuff like that. So she kind of settled in and made dinner for the kids, what was there, provisions. And so he was coming home at night and he saw the light on in the house and he thought, oh, one of the hired hands is in there, right? So as he opened the door, she was standing there with the 3 kids. Well, it was
Wow.
a very tearful reunion. And so they sat and enjoyed a meal and got reacquainted. And they shared a bottle of Casorso wine that she brought all the way from Italy, from the family vineyards over there.
What a celebration for
Yeah,
them.
yes.
And what did she do when she first arrived at the mission?
Well, she got her first night, get acquainted. The next day, Giovanni started saying, okay, this is what we do here. So he got her set up. He got her first to understand the lay of the land. There weren't normal provisions. So everything you cooked, ate, or whatever, you got from the land at the time. So she got into that and she started cooking for, I think it was 10 or 12 men for twice a day, because he had hired hands by that time that were helping him with different chores around the farm. So she's cooking for all these men plus her kids. She enjoyed it though, because she was happy to be there. But then she also learned a lot of the First Nations women came to her, and Giovanni had forged a really good relationship with the Salish. By that time, the time she came, he was already learning Chinook. And so he was, they really helped her with clothes and, medical needs for the kids, right? They just had natural medicines and stuff that they used from plants and different things like that. And so, yeah, she had a lot to learn. And then plus about ranch life, which she wasn't accustomed to.
Wow.
So, yeah.
So when did they preempt the original lands that you now live on?
So from my records, it says 1887 was the first 160 acres that they had preempted. Between the time Rosa came and 1887, Lorenzo Casorso had also come, my great-grandfather's brother from Northern Italy. So they had the Casorso brothers, it was kind of like a land holding. So they had about 320 acres that they had first settled. But the area where the homestead is was the first 160 acres. But you had to clear it within 3 years and farm it. So part of all that was, a lot of it was scrub, a lot of alder, a lot of cottonwood, stuff like that. So they had to clear the land, and they had to ditch the land. So 6-foot ditches dug by hand, and they had to drain it to sweeten the land. So they had to get the water out of the land, let it dry out. Then they would take manure from the animals and stuff like that, spread it on the land to sweeten the land so they could start growing things. But he discovered that pigs did a better job at clearing the ground than he did.
Oh, right.
So when he first came, he had asked Father Pandozzi for a few pregnant sows. which he gave him. So then he was building pens, and he would build structures that he could set up and take down to clear land. So they would clear a couple acres at a time. It was 1885, though, the end of 1885, that pigs got out and destroyed his garden. And so they were short of food over the winter, and that was a really tough winter for them.
How did they get through that winter?
Well, it was getting into February, and they had nothing left. They'd eaten everything. And one of his First Nations friends across the lake brought him a cow, a milking cow. And they never asked for it. He just happened to show up. So they thought you might need a cow. So from that cow that he gave them, they could make, milk twice a day, butter, stuff like that. And that got them through till they could start going out foraging, hunting again and all that stuff,
Yeah.
right? But yeah, it was nip and tuck. But the favor would be repaid a few years later in another harsh winter. So.
Well, that really demonstrates the friendship and respect that they had between their family and some of the local First Nations families.
They did, yes, up and down the valley, yes.
Can you tell us a bit more about the importance of horses at that time?
Yeah, well, it was the same thing. Father Pandozzi had lent him a horse for a while, but then he said, you got to go out and get your own.
Mm-hmm.
And so they had to, there's a lot of wild horses up in the mountains. So he had to venture off, and he had to go up and find his first horse, which he did, which is a big black stallion.
A wild horse.
A wild horse,
okay.
And he had to break it. So he had to tame it, and then that became his first horse, which was his best friend, till it died. I mean, it was everything to him. But it was, Father Pandozzi said, you're a natural at this.
Right, okay.
So that actually led to the first job opportunity, is breaking and selling horses up and down the valley. So he would, and as his sons got older, they would go up to the bush, get wild horses, bring them back in, break them, tame them, and then sell them. And that was one of their business opportunities that they did.
Wow, and I bet a lot of people are surprised to hear that there were wild horses in the area too.
And there was a lot. In fact, there was so many at one time, they had to take some of them out because there was just too many, and they were ruining the land and everything. No, they were their tractors. He would have, teams 4 or 5 horses side by side, pulling plows in the fields, clearing land,
Mhm.
like the equipment that they had designed, like to clear land was amazing. Yeah. And the horse was their truck and car and tractor.
Now, at some point, Giovanni Casorso, your great-grandfather,
Yeah.
became John Casorso.
Yes.
What's the story behind that?
Well, when they set up the first school, it was just a little makeshift cabin, and there was just a few kids, and there was the Casorsos, and there was the Guillards, and there was a few other families. So they did a makeshift schoolhouse, and one of the first teachers, Thomas LeDuc, he thought Casor, because the original spelling was with the Z, Casorzo, but he said it doesn't sound phonetically correct. So it was in the classroom that he had changed the name.
Okay.
And Giovanni, that's when Giovanni became John at the same time. So he went from Giovanni Casorzo to John Casorso.
Right, and
that
we still
particular
say
time.
Casorso today.
To this date, yep. And if you go to Tonko, Italy, where they're from, there's Casorsos buried beside Casorzos in the cemeteries there.
Related.
They're all related.
All related.
All related, yeah.
And it's complicated with the family tree when people change the spelling of their names.
Yeah.
As any genealogist knows.
And from what we've discovered around the world, we're all related from that one area. So, yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Really, really cool. So I believe that Gord has another video that he's going to share with us now. And the video shows Rob and Nadine walking through the bunkhouse on their property.
Thanks, Jen. Oops. Wrong video. Bear with me. Let's try that again.
This is actually the number 2 house, built by my great-grandfather. It was built in 1886. The original was a sod-roofed house, which was just over here. It collapsed in 1972. It's been recently, in the last few years, that Nadine and myself, we started to restore the buildings, and the hope is to get them back to the original scale. Nadine and our oldest daughter Amanda are doing weddings and events here, so we feel it would enhance the wedding feature to put the old porch back on the front, and to decorate it to scale on the inside as you would see in 1900. So when people enter the farm, it's like they're falling back into time.
But you see how short they must have been? The roofs are, the ceilings are
So tiny.
much room, yeah.
But you see how much light there is, even though there's very few windows up here. So this is the original bed spring that was on their bed, and it was their potbelly stove. So basically this was their area at night. So in the middle was a sitting room, you know, where you would read or do whatever, right? So,
Yeah.
but you can feel the airflow, you know, in here. There's a lot of light, and it's quite cool, even though it's warm outside. Our kids used to play up here, and we kept
played
a
it
chalkboard in here, and they had an old desk from the 30s.
Yeah, this was the only room that they sort of played in.
Yeah, so we left the chalkboard on.
Yeah, just marrying into this family with all this history. I embraced it from the beginning, and I love antiques, I love old things, and so yeah, I just think it's really cool. And the more we can keep the legacy and pass it on to our kids, like the better. So yeah, I love it.
But when you get older and you start to learn the history and understand what it took and the courage it took for people to leave their homeland, their country, their families, a lot of times never seeing them again, to come here, I think that's what drives Nadine and myself to improve everything, is the courage it took to come and settle and to survive, right?
All right, back to you, Jen.
Okay. Did you hear that, Gordon?
No, we didn't hear anything until just
Yep.
now.
Okay. That's what I thought.
I'm sure it was brilliant, though.
It was probably the most eloquent thing that I'll say all evening. So it's really special to be able to see inside the home of Rosa and Giovanni Casorso. And they certainly were resourceful and entrepreneurial. They would go on to become one of the most successful operations in the valley. What areas of agriculture did Giovanni and the boys in the family extend to, Rob?
Well, after, as the boys started to get older, a lot of vegetables. So they would, probably by 1906, they had one of the biggest onion operations in Canada. Giovanni Casorso was known as the Onion King of Canada, growing 30 tons of onions to the acre. He was known as far east as Great Britain, you know, as onions. But not only that, the quality of, they got into the abattoir business, the raising of cattle, sheep, pigs. They would take animals up and down the valley, and they would sell them to people. They would, butcher them on the spot, and basically whatever they could do to make them up, to make money, they would do. They started bringing in in conjunction with Father Pandozzi, fruit trees. They had plums and apples and pears and peaches, anything they could grow, cherries. And then they brought in some grapes, and they were experimenting with vineyards. And they were big into horse breeding. They raised and sold a lot of horses up and down the valley. They cattle, from Osoyoos to Kamloops, and farther east. So anything they could grow and sell, they would grow and sell. So
it's amazing to think that your family has been continuously farming on the same land for almost 140 years.
Yes.
Is it officially 139 years?
It's 139 years, yes.
Amazing.
Yes.
Can you tell us about how the tradition has gone from generation to generation?
Well, with farming, it's ebb and flow, right? You do well and you think you're going along good, and then the markets change. So then you got to pull and replant or change. So for myself, I grew up in a house where my father grew pears, apples, and grapes, but we also had the hog business. So, I was working in the abattoir till 1997. We raised 400 hogs a year. We would bring them to Elikman's Delicatessen plus sell privately in the winter to a lot of the Italian, Portuguese, a lot of the Chinese families in the valley would come and get their winter pigs. But over time, eventually, the prices fell out of the hog market. So we got out of that. So then we got heavier into fruit trees. Well, now, the markets are kind of failing there. So we're going heavier into grapes again, right? So it's whatever you can make money at is what you shift into, but it's getting harder and harder. But that doesn't diminish our love for it either. So, yeah.
It shows this hardworking entrepreneurial spirit of the Casorso family.
Yes. Yeah. Well, and for Nadine and myself, my wife and myself, we have these old buildings in our yard, and we hit a crossroads about 4 or 5 years ago where we said, do we let them fall or do we restore them? And so we decided we were going to start restoring them, but it's a heavy cost. So our eldest daughter, Amanda, she said, you can make a lot of money, or not a lot of money, but you can make some money, doing weddings and stuff here. So that's one thing that we looked at. And so in conjunction with Amanda and Nadine and myself, that's kind of helping, pay for the restoration of the buildings. And you look at them and you think, well, they're just buildings, but they're buildings that my great grandparents built, and my grandfather and his brothers, and it's not something you can easily let go, at least for me.
Now, before we see the next video, we were going to have a little peek at a few of the wine bottles that are on display here. And these wine bottles have been really carefully selected because of some of the stories that they have attached to them. And we wanted to give you a little teaser about this particular bottle right here. The Kelowna Vineyard Sovereign Opal 1989. And remember that we're going to talk about it again a little bit later on the Zoom. And Gord, I think we're ready for that next video that you have.
Perfect. Thank you. Let's see if I can get the right video this time.
By 1906 and completed in 1907 is the house you're in right now. I believe it would have been a very special moment, that first step into this house, considering what they started with was virtually nothing. And I think it was a very strong threshold in the family. So the tradition of family gatherings, hasn't stopped. It keeps here was where great grandpa sat as he looked out, probably amongst his family, and all the discussions of the time and plans for the farm and whatever issues were happening in the world. And my grandpa sat there, and my father, and I sit there when we have family gatherings. Something like this was pretty amazing.
What do you do?
And you got to kind of get a rhythm with the pedals. As we go up the stairs, it's kind of another walk through history. So just kind of a little walk down memory lane of some of the artifacts and things that were used in those time periods. So Anna did a really good job of setting the room up to kind of capture some of that atmosphere.
And it happened that he died in the war, but his uniform was here. And this is a letter that he wrote
To my father,
To-
just
yeah.
a week before he died. You know, we understand our roots, you know, where we came from and the history and the value that went into it. You know, hard work, faith, commitment to the community, and growing food. You know, I was thinking a little while ago how many millions of pounds of food of all types that have been produced on the land. You know, it's been a journey of feeding the country, you know, feeding the community. And, you know, it's an honor to carry on in that journey.
So actually, Rob, when we come back, it's amazing to me that so many members of the Casorso family have almost established these museums, these family museums. Like John and Anna, I mean, their whole attic is basically a museum. Where does this, you know, this kind of connection to the past with the Casorso family, it seems to be very prevalent.
Yeah, like, you know, I have to give credit where credit is due. A lot of the traditions, they come through the mothers, you know, like they carry the tradition. And, you know, Rosa carried that tradition through, you know, to the next generation. And then when my mother came from England, she didn't have a choice. She had to jump right into it. But she brought her British daintiness, and she added that touch to it all. But she loved the history of the family, and she kept that history alive, and she always kept the house beautiful. And, you know, every memento in that house meant so much to her. And I think that's where it comes from. I mean, you probably talked with Velma Sperling and the pride that she has, you know, through Uncle Pete's side. And, you know, Vic Casorso's family down in Oliver, they have the same pride. And it's almost like it came through us through Giovanni and Rosa. The love of the land, the love of working hard, the love of family, the love of faith, as John said. So I have to give most of the credit to the wives, the mothers that, you know, that carry the traditions through to this present moment.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
So Rob, do you still feel the presence of Rosa and Giovanni in the home and on the land?
Yeah, especially when you go outside. Every time I walk in the bunkhouse, you know, I feel like I'm being watched. Sometimes I feel like I didn't get up early enough in the morning, but but you touch the wood, that they carved with their hands. You touch the ground that they walked on. You know, you go into the blacksmith shop and you see all the things that they made with their hands, you know, forging iron. Then you know, you go up to the bench and you take pride in the fact that they cleared all this land by hand. It was all forest. It was scrub, and they made it something out of it. And yeah, every day you feel blessed that, or I do, I feel blessed that I'm part of this family, and that's what drives me to carry the traditions on.
So we can really see that the Casorso family, they planted the seeds of early agriculture here in the Okanagan. It also feels as they planted the seeds of what eventually would become a thriving Italian community. So how did your family's presence here lead to other Italians coming to the area?
Well, it was 1893 that Giovanni had contacted his friend Luigi Rampone in Italy and encouraged him to come over, and he did, and that was the next family to arrive was the Rampone family.
And the next person to join our Zoom is Don Rampone. And Don, we'd love to hear a little bit about your family connection to this story.
Well, I'm going to back up just a little bit on that. A few Italian families came here before my great-grandfather. They didn't stay here, though. The first one was the Coscetti family, Carlo Coscetti, who came over. They came over under different circumstances than a lot of the following families did. Life was pretty poor in Italy at the time, and the Coscetti family in particular was really hard hit. They lost 2 kids, and Carlo Coscetti lost his wife the year before they came over here. So I think it was sort of a let's go for broke, let's go to this new country, this new world. All he had left was one son. So Carlo Coscetti came over here and joined Giovanni Casorso in his trek to Kelowna. And then later on, he sent for his son Antonio, and he put him in school in Victoria. And from Victoria, after he graduated school in Victoria, came to Kelowna and actually pre-entered Milan as well. But they didn't stay here very long. They left and went for parts unknown. I'm sure where they went. The next family that we have track of coming over was Carlo Bolaño. Carlo Bolaño brought his wife over and family, and he had 1 child born here at Okanagan Mission as well. And Carlo Bolaño was quite a businessman. He actually had a house in Okanagan Mission, according to the census records, and he had a farm at Duck Lake. And he was quite an influential fellow. And we found an ad in the Oliver newspaper advertising eggs. And so he was an egg rancher, egg farmer. But he sold most of his eggs to the Kalamalka Hotel in Vernon. And I'm just trying to think of the logistics of this in 1890 something. Advertising in Oliver, living in Okanagan Mission, farming at Duck Lake, and selling eggs in Vernon was quite a important and difficult life to be living. Didn't stay here long. Returned to Victoria and then back to San Francisco, where they all came through originally to start with. But the first family in my involvement with it, my great-grandfather Luigi did come over in 1893 to help out Giovanni on the farm. And later on, a few years following that, my great-grandmother never did come over. She stayed in Italy, but my great-grandmother's relatives all came over. And one of her family members, the DePavo family, was the next family on the scene type of thing. And then the DePavos and a whole bunch of families followed. In fact, trying to keep track of them was the sort of topic of the book we put together in 2018 for our family reunion. And it's the story of the DePavos, Casorsos, Lanfrancos, Turis, and Riso families. And they're all related. And the story is about the 3 sisters, my great-grandmother, Melania Rampone, and Raquetta Rampone, which is Rob's great-grandmother, and Annetta Riso. And she was a Rampone as well, married Vincenzo Riso. So the story of all these families following, once they got here, a lot of them became intermarried, and so the story continued on for many of those families.
So we are going to hear more from Don in a few moments. And I just wanted to go back to the Casorsos for a moment. So your family has been here for 14 decades. What do you see in store for the future of your family here?
Well, we're hoping that our children will carry on. John's son is farming with them right now, in our operation. My daughter Sarah, who's in Niagara Falls at the time, right now she's coming home, hopefully in 4 to 5 years. She has plans to do her own thing. So the plan is for the farm to continue in some form of agriculture. Myself, I see it more going into agritourism, maybe capitalizing on the history, educational, that type of thing, because we are a connection to the beginning. And part of our view was that by restoring the buildings, you can see it as it was, but it's still a living farm. Unlike Father Pandolzi Mission, where it's more of a museum, we're still farming the same land, and you know, we've kept that history alive, and we can keep the buildings alive, so you can see present day, but what it was like in the beginning. You know, that link to that link.
Rob, thank you so much for sharing that story of your family.
Welcome.
And Rob is not going anywhere quite yet, but we're going to switch gears a little bit here. So we are inside, as we mentioned at the beginning, we're inside this newly designed Okanagan Wine and Orchard Museum. The museum shut down 2 years ago, almost to the day. I probably don't have to remind anybody what happened 2 years ago right now. But we shut down the museum. And when we realized that the shutdown was going to be longer than originally expected, we decided to use that as an opportunity to redesign the museum in a way that we probably wouldn't be able to do if we were still open to the public. So we have now just reopened, and we're going to do sort of a mini tour of this new space. And we're bringing back Don Rampone. He's going to share with us a few of his personal stories and also a few of his personal belongings, objects from his family that he's brought in to share with you during this Zoom tonight. So we're going on a little Zoom adventure through our new museum. Here we go. So the side of the museum that we're in now is really looking at the land. It's looking at preparing the soil, planting the seeds, and of course, a really important part of that is irrigation. We live in a hot, dry place, and the irrigation is a big part of the story. And I'm going to tilt us all the way up here. You can see we have samples of several different kinds of irrigation pipes. So Don, can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, one of the interesting stories about the irrigation system is that the first farmers here had to do all their own development of that irrigation system. They actually went up in the hills, found reserves of water, built the ditches and canals to get that water to the land. As more and more families arrived here and more involved with orcharding and growing crops in general, they had devised master systems. So they started getting together into groups of people. And as you can see by some of the photographs, some of the structures of getting water to their land were quite intricate and involved building all kinds of looms and above ground irrigation ditches. They had to travel from the high hills across valley bottoms and up the other side. So getting water to all parts of the land was very important. It was a very natural thing to have all these irrigation ditches and flumes around your houses. In fact, one of the recent photos I found on Facebook was the picture of the armories, or the BC Dragoons headquarters, which was an old school house at one time. And as you can see, surrounding the whole school are irrigation ditches that you had to walk over to get to school. So they were a common part, even in downtown Kelowna. They were everywhere as part of Kelowna.
And this picture here, this is downtown Kelowna.
This is downtown
right?
Kelowna. This is corner of Richter Street and what is now Lawrence Avenue. Next picture I have is of the Rampone fruit vegetable stand, which I when I was about 10 years old, we started going. And surrounding our vegetable stand is this irrigation trough. And went right through our stand. You can build a water wheel into it. So we had a lot of fun with this water as well. And it became a natural place to play in, place to wash all the vegetables. They were all over the town. And we got to step over these ditches and all the time to get anywhere. So it was a very important thing. But as they got more organized, that water came from a long ways away. And there are whole books written about those irrigation systems, like the one that came out a couple of years ago, Black Mountain Gold, the story of the Black Mountain Irrigation District. It's complete, all kinds of dams, reservoirs, huge canal systems coming in to get the water down here where we needed it. There's a particular story that is really intriguing in this whole thing. We found the 1911 census. We found that the Belgo Fruit and Land Company had a work camp up in Belgo area, and it had 147 people in it. Of those 147 people, 87 were Italians. Most of them brought here, particularly to do this job. They were recruited to come here to this country. The list of names is, some of them are hard to understand and read because they're written in the census record, but we were able to find my great-grandfather, Pasquale Alamonte, who came here that year to work on that project. He is one of the few families that stayed here. A lot of these families went on to other projects, including projects like the KVR Railway. So it's an interesting story to follow these things. There's actually a town site of Belgo that was laid out. It never was developed, but it was actually a main street, and it's the land where Felix Casorso's house stands, and it's still standing today. And we often wondered why his front door was facing away from the road. Well, actually, it would have been on Main Street, Belgo, if they would have went through this development. So it's an interesting story. But as well as having the practical reasons for having the irrigation ditches, they're a lot of fun to play with. I think Rob's got a bit of a story. So Rob, do you want to share this? Come on, tell us about these ditches. What did you do with them?
What did we do with the ditches? Well, when I was a little boy, we had the flumes up on the bench, and you can see them on the right there. So, and at the end of the flume, there's usually a junction box, and that junction box was, act as a spillway, and they could direct the water into the ditches. Well, we used to play in there as kids, and every once in a while there'd be a fish in there. So we had little wee kids going up there with fishing poles trying to catch a fish in the junction box on the end of the flume. And it acted as a nice pool in the summer too, because the beach was a long ways away. So
There's a lot of uses for that irrigation ditch.
Yes.
Our favorite last time was to take out old, big, huge, overripe cucumbers, haul them out and make little boats out of them and run them down the rivers and creeks to see who made it down the end of the ditch first. However, sometimes we forget about them and they'd end up plugging up Dad's irrigation ditches. So we weren't too popular sometimes with those. But it was lots of fun.
That sounds like something fun to do with the kids still today.
Yes, it is. So let's head over to the honey display.
So as we move on to our next exhibit, you're getting a sneak peek into the new classroom space that we have here in the museum. And we've had kids in here, even just the last couple of days over spring break, learning about Okanagan orchards and learning about wild bees. Speaking of wild bees.
Tony Casorso was Antonio Casorso was the beekeeper of the family. And he learned the trade from a friend of his who taught him all he needed to know and went on with doing this, running his bee collection. And even the sign up here showing the proprietor of Benbow and apiaries. And in the museum, there are also lots of examples of the honey cans with his name on them.
And so this is one that you've brought in today.
Yes, I brought this one, but this is not mine. This came from Judy Casorso. And Judy is one of the family members, one of the great-granddaughters of Giovanni. And she's made it her mission to collect all things Casorso related. And when I asked her the other night about why she's doing this, she said it was tricky to get the history back in the family. So all the next generations could learn all about the Casorso family and have some of their remains or their relics or objects with them that their family had used. So it's a great story. Tony Casorso was my neighbor. And so I grew up knowing him quite well. In grade 11, I actually did a report on the colonial history. And to do that report, I interviewed Tony many times. And it was great to have the stories that he was able to relate to me. And one of the things I found about a lot of our old timers is you ask them one question and you could be there a long time because you get many, many stories from them. Mm-hmm. One of my favorite stories that he used to tell was he never learned how to drive a car. And his whole reason for it was telling the story that he could ride on a horse much better than he could a car, especially when he fell asleep on the way home. It was buggy. The horse knew the way home and he would take him right home. He never did trust cars to do that. So that's a sort of interesting perspective on things.
I think he was wise to trust the horse.
Right.
Now, do you still have that old high school report?
I do. I must take that out someday. I must take that out. One other thing about, I think it's fantastic. I was at university at the time, but I heard of Tony's passing, and he died, but I consider it in a fantastic situation if there is such a thing. He was found at the chicken coop on Easter Sunday morning. He went out to feed the chickens and look after the chickens and never came back in. And that's a beautiful story, I think, to tell and share about his life. Okay, from here, I think we'll move on to the other part of the museum.
Okay, so we are going to do a little bit more exploring. And as we move to our picking area, we think about harvesting the fruit. We're going to have a look at this amazing ladder that goes all the way up. And it reminds me of a story of a gentleman who came into the museum one day and looked at this ladder, and he said that he remembers climbing those ladders when he worked in the orchards, and he remembers that they were bendy at the top, so you could sort of sway and move them around to pick more apples. And this is the kangaroo. Can you see why? Here we go. It's because of the pouch. A way to pick the fruit from way up high. And speaking of picking fruit, Don has another special object that he's brought in to share with us.
Yes, this is a picking bag that was purchased in the 1940s by John Riso. And John Riso, like many other farm boys at the time, used to go off the farm to earn extra money for the family. And one of the jobs he used to do in the wintertime was to go to places like creameries and box making factories, packing houses, and do some work for them. Summertime, however, they turned their attention to working outside. And one of the things John Riso did was he went out working for the Casorso family when he was about 15 years old. And one of the first things he did was buy a picking bag. And from then on, he was able to work for any other orchard around. And this is the picking bag that he actually had, and he has now donated it to the museum. And what I think is fantastic about this, not just the picking bag, but we have stories to go with it. So included with this picking bag comes to the museum are stories about the family and the picking of his life. Now, what's special about this picking bag is that it came from the Casorso family, and this is what we're talking about tonight. So I think it's a perfect day to make this donation to the museum on behalf of John Riso and his family.
That's such a special picking bag, and you can see that it's been well worn and well loved.
Yes, patched with denim materials all over the place.
So we're going to continue on with our mini tour with Don, and we're going to cross the hall into the other side of the museum. And I mentioned that this side is looking at what's happening on the ground, the picking and the planting. Let me switch back here. And on the other side of the museum, we're going to have a look more at the packaging and the processing, another really important part of the final product that we get. So we're going to cross through. Many of you have likely been in the Laurel Packing House for different events over the years, and you may be somewhat familiar with the hallway that I'm crossing right now. So I'm going to actually go the long way around here so that I can show you a couple of these amazing machines that we have on display. So we have some different presses used to make juices and wines. This huge machine is a cherry pitter. And one of the most amazing sherry barrels that I've ever seen. So we're going to meet Don around the corner here, and what you can see in front of you is the apple picking line where the apple wrapper flappers would pack apples to get them ready to be shipped out on the trains to the markets across Canada and the States, and even all the way over into Europe. And as we cross here, I'm sure that you will recognize our very Kelowna famous or Okanagan famous apple crate labels.
I have a bit of a story to tell about these boxes too. We're going to be going later on to see the machine that actually makes the lids for these boxes. The boxes themselves are actually made by hand. And a couple of years ago, I was in the museum archives when a lady came in from BC Tree Fruits with a whole stack of papers. And these were all carbon copy prints on onion skin paper. And they're all from the 1930s and 40s. And she was told to clear the office and just get rid of them. And she started dumping the things, and she realized maybe these are important. So she brought them over to the archives and asked if they wanted them. And Terra in the archives said certainly, because they spelled out a thing we never even thought of before. In those records, it was the payment sheet of how the workers would get paid for making these boxes. They were paid for every nail they put into these boxes. They were paid a certain rate for short nails and a higher rate for longer nails, because it would take longer to pound in a longer nail. And these sheets spelled out in detail those exact working conditions and payment schedules. So I think it's a very important little document to have found and brought in, because it's something we didn't really think about before. But then once the boxes were packed and filled, they needed these special lids put on. The lids were made very flexible, so they could sort of hold the fruit in very tightly. So they were made to sort of take the form to sort of take the curve of the fruit and actually hold them still, move around. These lids were actually made by machine. And we'll actually go and stop. Next stop is look at that machine that made them.
Okay, so this is an incredible looking machine. It looks very complicated. Don, what can you tell us about this?
Well, this machine was one of the few machines that they had on the open line type of thing. And the workers selected to run this machine were selected by the foreman to be very reliable people, the ones he trusted. One of those people in 1940, 1937, I believe was my mom. My mom actually ran the machine very much like this. And she was selected by this Charlie Dalla was the foreman at the time. And Charlie Dalla his family story has just been written this year. And his story is going to be included in this year's collection of 2022 stories of our first Italian families here in Kelowna. This is a project that the Kelowna Canadian Italian Club started 3 years ago. We started in 2019 with this collection of stories of the families that were here before 1919 for over 100 years in Kelowna. And we found 30 stories, easy to tell. We followed it up in 2020 with families that arrived between the 20s and 30s. And last year we did the families that arrived in the 40s and 50s. And this year's stories are about the Italian families who formed the Italian Canadian Club in 1966. And Charlie Dalla was one of those families. And his daughter has written a very beautiful story for us to put in that book. So some of these machines have some personal meanings to me as well.
And I didn't get the closest look at that picture of your mom, but is she standing beside this machine?
She's
in that picture?
In this picture, yes. Okay.
Yes. That's great. So I think it makes a lot of sense as we're talking about all of this agriculture, before we head over to our Q&A, to finish up by talking a little bit about wine. So we're going to bring Rob and Don together to talk about wine, and remember that bottle of the Sovereign Opal that we had a glance at earlier. Let's hear the story about that.
Okay. Well, the story is going to end up with having that special bottle we talked about in between this bottle, the Casorso wine bottle, and the next bottle, a Rampone wine bottle, and how the story fits in the middle of those two.
Just need to twist that slightly. There we go.
These two wine bottles are wines from Italy. They're not from Kelowna. But the story about the Kelowna wines that fit in between is what we'll share now. But some of the varieties of grapes and special wines they've made. Rob, could you do anything you tell us about those? Or
About those particular wines?
No, but the wines different.
Well, like in there, a lot of those wines were originally made at Kelowna Wines. Cap Capozzi was he opened up the first commercial winery in Canada, and it was here in Kelowna. There was 4 original investors, and 2 of them were my grandfather Louis and my uncle Peter. And you know, from the 1930s up to present day, we've always had a connection to Kelowna Wines, which is now owned by Andrew Pella Limited, and is now kind of morphed into Sandhill. But earlier on, you had viewed a bottle of Sovereign Opal from 1989. Well, the Sovereign Opal was in the 60s, Summerland Research Station was developing. They're trying to come up with new varietals, you know, for wine in the valley. And as it was, they had crossed, well, they had developed Sovereign Opal, which is a cross of Marichal Foch, which is a red, and Golden Moscato, which is a white. Well, the Marichal Foch was brought to the valley by the Blondet family from Alsace-Lorraine, France. And it was first grown on the west side, but by the 60s and 70s, a lot of growers were growing it in the valley. I'm assuming that some of it was put into Somme Rouge and some of the other reds at Kelowna Wines. But, and the Golden Moscato was some of the plants were brought over from my grandfather, his brother, and a few other gentlemen. But unbeknownst to us, they had crossed these two plants which had two family connections. So the Blondet family, Andre Sr., he's married to Eileen Gaspardoni, and Eileen Gaspardoni is my dad's second cousin. And so we figured out I didn't even know we were related till a few years ago. And then we realized the connection, with the wine it was quite interesting to know that, a grape that was brought over from our family and a grape brought over by the Blondet family, who still had a Casorso connection. They blended these two plants together to make Sovereign Opal, which is what we grow today. 1988, there was the big grape pull. There were 6 original growers of Sovereign Opal. 1988, the provincial government paid growers to pull their grapes because there was a surplus, and my mother convinced my father to keep our 2.5 acres of Sovereign Opal. So that 1989 bottle was the first vintage where it was just our grapes. So
I think some of the successes that the families have faced here in this new world, I think, weren't by accident. They were the result of a lot of hard work and families that got together. I'd like to share with you a bit of a chart that shows how some of these families are connected together and the reason for the success. So if we start this whole,
We've just got some shadow.
If we start by looking at Luigi Gaspardoni up here. Luigi Gaspardoni came here and worked for Giovanni Casorso on the farm. And he married Maria Bevilacqua. His wife was Maria Bevilacqua. And Maria was a cousin to Rosa Bevilacqua, who was Giovanni Casorso's wife. So we already have a relationship, and this is Rob Casorso's family line here, being the great-grandson. We go back to Luigi Gaspardoni. He had a son named Angelo Gaspardoni. Angelo's daughter, Eileen, married the Blondel family, Andre Blondel. So we have a connection in this family. Luigi had another daughter named Rosa Gaspardoni, who married Dino de Pavo. And Dino de Pavo's father was Germano de Pavo. Germano de Pavo's wife was Enriqueta Rampone. Enriqueta had 2 sisters, Melanie Rampone, my great-grandmother, and Annette Riso. So this is me over on this side. And besides that, Rob and I are third cousins through his grandfather, Louis Casorso and Katrina de Pavo. So that's how some families all get together and are all connected somehow here. And one of the reasons that they were so successful is they relied on family structures like this to get by.
It's a complicated and beautiful family tree. So I think that this is a really great time for us to open up for questions.
All right, well, I'll maybe kick us off. Rob, you were talking about the Sovereign Opal, and I know Sovereign Opal has actually a connection to one of our other members, Frank Marcano. Can you talk a little bit about that?
yeah, Frank was actually an amazing winemaker at Kelowna Wines, and he was actually the first winemaker to tame Sovereign Opal. It was because it was a so-called hybrid. There was no problem with growing this plant. You get 20-foot canes on these plants, so they grew pretty wild. So it took us a number of years to tame the plant, but he was the first one because it was higher in acid, higher in pH. He was actually the first winemaker to kind of make the first good wine out of it that didn't taste green and stuff. And he actually trained Howard Soon. So Howard Soon, after Frank retired, took over and making it, and now Sandy Lear is. So it's but Frank was the first guy to tame it and to make a good wine out of it. And he's the only one I know that's made a sparkling wine out of Sovereign Opal. and I had the chance to taste it, and it was amazing. So
I've drank Frank's wine on many occasions, and I can vouch for how good it is.
yes, very good winemaker.
Anyone else, if you have a question, feel free to unmute yourselves. If you'd rather not do it that way, you can just enter your question in the chat window and I'll ask it for you.
Good time for the boss.
Oh, we have one.
We have a shy bunch tonight.
Yeah, it's Dave Hawkins of KCIC. I was just wondering, with climate change, do you foresee issues with crops in the Okanagan Valley given decades?
Do you want me to answer that? Well, you take last year, for instance, we've never seen 45-degree weather ever. And, you know, it's funny, you talk about irrigation systems and drip irrigations, and it's always about water conservation. But my father always believed in overhead irrigation. And he's seen it hot, but not that hot before. And there, you know, you have fluctuations in temperatures, but not in the 45s. And last year, a lot of guys struggled, and we actually had one of our best crops ever because we had a chance to cool the trees down. So which allowed us to keep the grass longer. Yeah, but it is a concern. You know, you have to understand your orchards, you have to understand your vineyards, you have to be in there daily, especially when you have these massive temperature fluctuations. And it doesn't make farming more challenging, that's for sure. Plus insects. The hotter it is, you get more and more insects, you get more and more hatches of insects, which you know, if you grow it, something will eat it or attack it. So, yeah.
Great, thanks.
You're welcome.
Go ahead, David.
Yeah, also, just about Sovereign Opal, I think this is one of the very few places in the world where that we make Sovereign Opal wine. Is that correct?
Yes, yeah. So Sandhill has the rights just to make the Sovereign Opal. Shaverton out of Langley, they contract to us for 35 tons a year. They make a white blend. And now another vineyard out of Abbotsford called Blue Rabbit, they are using it as a blend. But right now, Sandhill, who's owned by Andrew Color Limited, they're the only ones allowed to make Sovereign Opal at this time. Yeah.
And it's a wonderful wine, I agree.
Thank you. Yes, we like it. We like giving it away too.
Thanks, Rob.
Thank you.
Rob, we talked a little bit about the whole livestock and supplying meat up and down the valley.
Yeah.
Maybe talk a little bit about the sanitary markets.
Well, back in, as with any farming, it's not the farmer that usually makes the money, it's the middleman that makes the money. And it was around 1912 that there was a gentleman that came in from Calgary, and he was talking to Giovanni about how maybe he could do his own marketing, his own selling, and his own production of his, you know, have his own meat packing plant, have his own stores. So it kind of put the bug in his ear. So then he got together with his sons, and they decided to start Casorso Brothers Meat Company, meat packing company, and they built the Casorso block, which is on Bernard, and that became the center in Kelowna, the sanitary meat market. So we had the abattoir out on the farm, and that abattoir serviced the sanitary meat market. Plus, they would sell direct. You know, they put in, they would go in the winter and they would cut ice blocks, and they would put them in the attics, you know, of some of their facilities to keep the meat cool, so it would last longer. And then they put in smokehouses, and they'd had cured bacon, ham, sausages, whatever they could. Whatever they could do with meat, they would do it up and down the valley. But they decided to make the most money was to cut out the middleman. So they had a store in Penticton, Kelowna, Vernon, and Kamloops, and it became the Casorso Brothers. But the main building, which is still there, Casorso Place on Bernard, that was the sanitary meat market, which later became, was owned by TK Gordon, became the Gordon Meat Market later on.
And I think
research on, research on the sanitary markets. Sanitary markets was actually a generic term that was used for quite a few years to differentiate the actually abattoir, the slaughterhouse area, to ensure people that they were coming not to the slaughterhouse, but to a market to buy things. So the sanitary market was also used in other stores besides the Casorso owned ones. I found one in Enderby as well. We thought there was a connection, but it wasn't. It was a different connection. So the word sanitary market was a generic term for a while, although the Casorso brothers did sort of corner the market on them.
And one thing I think when we talk about agriculture in the valley, you know, we tend to forget that before the fruit, before the irrigation, before the ground crops, this was cattle country, like right up and down the valley. There were huge cattle ranching operations. Rob, at kind of the height of the Casorso involvement, how many acres did you have between rangelands and up and down the valley that belonged to the family or that the family was using for active farming?
Yeah, well, you take, well, when Giovanni first came, he got his 2 acres. And by 1925, Giovanni and his 8 sons owned 35,000 acres in the valley and had over 350,000 acres of rangeland, deeded rangeland. So, you know, not too bad for that short period of time. But he never, you know, one thing Giovanni did is he always believed in family first. Like there was a point where he could have retired. He had made quite a bit of money, but instead of retiring, he went and bought farms, helped his sons buy farms. And then in doing so, they started their own operations and then they started to work together and then they started to expand. And that's how they seemed to amass such a huge number of acres of land in such a short period of time. So.
Yeah, and I mean, we still have family. I mean, we showed a clip of actually Dave Casorso down south of Okanagan Falls, still ranching on land there.
Yeah. Well, one point I never brought up before was, and Giovanni, when he came here, the First Nations people said, watch the animals, because the animals will tell you what kind of a winter it's going to be. So I think it was 1885, 1886. It was a really, really bad winter. But he had observed, he was observing the coyotes. He noticed their fur was thicker. He was looking at the horses and the cattle. They had more fur than normal. The woolly caterpillar had a wider stripe. You know, I mean, that might be all wives' tales, right? But this is what is in the story. But anyway, so he stored up more hay than everybody else. So he actually developed more hayland. He grew sweet alfalfa, sweet clover, and he stacked a lot of it. And there's some big ranchers, including the Douglas Lake Ranch. They lost like thousands of head of cattle, and Giovanni didn't lose any. And it was that winter, all his cattle survived and fattened up, and he drove them to Kamloops, and he got one of the highest prices in the day because he was the only one with cattle at the time. And that was just from what he had learned through Father Pandozzi and some of the First Nations, the Salish here, you know, so.
I've got I got a question from Denise. It's interesting to hear the connection to our First Nations. How did that relationship evolve over time? Oh my goodness, that's a big question, but let's see how we can handle it.
Well, from our point of view, from what I've read, Giovanni and Rosa had an incredible relationship. Up and down the valley. In fact, you know, it was so good that, you know, by 1912-ish range, you know, things were getting pretty tense, but it didn't matter when any of the Casorso boys went, they were always welcome, no matter which, you know, reserve or wherever they came across, they're always welcome because of Giovanni's connection. And when he died, there was over 100 members of the First Nations. I think they outnumbered the pioneers at the funeral that came to pay their respects to Giovanni and Rosa, which makes me very proud, you know, so. Don, you might be able to add to that.
That's great.
Yeah, I mean, certainly it's a complex issue, but one thing that is just interesting to note, so the traditional fishing fishing area was basically right on Mission Creek there, right? So basically right on your land. So there was a lot of sharing that happened in that space.
Yeah. Yeah, and there was times where they were left alone because it was their traditional fishing grounds. They would come over and they were left alone to fish because that was, according to what I've read, Giovanni and Rosa, because their lands kind of were on either side, but no, this is your time. And they would let them come in and do their fish. They would actually set up their own tripods and smoke racks and all kinds of stuff, and they would dry it right on the spot, and they would be there for 2-3 weeks at a time. So there was a lot of respect, given both ways, and
I know in the 20s and 30s, according to our newspaper articles, numerous Italian families being brought to court for hunting out of season, fishing, saying it was rabbit, but it was actually grouse and pheasants, or vice versa. The fishing, picking things out of the wilds, followed all the First Nations traditions of gathering food for survival. Most of the times they were thrown out of court. The issue was tossed out, saying that was just for food, and it was against the law technically, I guess, but they were thrown out because looking at the traditions that the families were bringing with them, brought from Italy and based on the First Nations people here, and that food gathering was a very important part of their life. And these were kicking down the creek, not coconuting. These are kicking. That's clear.
Yeah. Well, I know when, like, we were kids, Jack Bedford, he used to dredge the creek every July when it was low. He would take the gravel out of the creek. Well, that creek was red with kokanee, but it was around 1973 they stopped dredging the creek, and that's when the numbers started to go down, to what we see today. And what also happened was he kept the water table lower. So a lot of the lowlands in that area could be farmed with just about anything, right? But now the water table is rising because the creek bed is always rising. The bridge used to be, Mission Creek Bridge was quite a bit lower. They built 4 bridges and each one gets higher and higher and higher because they keep building the banks higher and higher and higher. And so it's raising the water table too as well, right? So you probably remember better than me,
We have time for one more question if anyone wants to ask Rob or Don a question. All right. Well, maybe
there's one more question in your chat. I think it's also from Denise, and it was before the one that she asked. She asks, "Where's the sovereign opal now?"
Yeah, I think Rob kind of covered that when he said where it was being produced.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, you can get it at any liquor store, any grocery store. It's readily available. It's about $20 a bottle, and yeah, you get it anywhere.
And I'm going to add a final thing for myself here is when you look at some of these exhibits in the museum, there are beautiful signs telling what's happening. There's good objects here, but when you actually come here to visit them and see them, it sort of brings questions to your mind and stories and connections that don't come to your mind unless you come here and actually see them. So come on down and see these things, and you may find some neat stories here that you don't even know that existed.
Don?
So I'll, before we kind of wrap up, I just want to talk about a little bit about the presentation we have next month, April 13th. We're going to be talking about Pier 21, which, as many of you know, is kind of the primary influx point for a lot of immigrants coming to Canada in Halifax. A friend of ours, Nancy Spina, did a documentary specifically about the story of the women coming through Pier 21 and coming to a new country and what life was like for them. And I think, Rob touched on it today. Sometimes a lot of the family histories are maintained by the mothers and the wives and the sisters and the daughters in the family. And I think certainly with our committee, we want to make sure that we're gender balanced in our storytelling. So I think next month will be a very special presentation, and that's actually our wrap up for our season. I will push out the link to our website where you can register for that. Again, that's April 13th. Admission is free. You just have to register on Eventbrite. We'll be watching the documentary, and then Nancy will be joining us to talk a little bit about what was behind the making of that documentary and to field any questions that anyone might have. By the way, if anyone is ever in Halifax and you have a chance, go to the Pier 21 Museum. It's actually exceptional. And it really gives you a good idea of what that immigrant experience was, coming to a new country and that kind of shock of adjusting to a new culture all at once. All right, I'm going to turn it back to you, Jen, to do your thank yous then. And then I think Roseanne's going to join us for the last words from the club.
Okay, thanks so much, Gord. And thank you all for joining us virtually today. And special thanks to our guest speakers tonight, Rob Casorso and Don Rampone, who, by sharing these stories of their families, it just really brings everything to life. And as Don mentioned, when you come into the museum, it really does bring these stories to life and gives us some great insight into some of these early European families who work so hard on the land here. And my last words are going to be, I think maybe everybody should go and pick up a bottle of Sovereign Opal and share it with family and friends this weekend. Thank you.
All right, Roseanne, over to you.
I just want to say what an amazing presentation. This was fantastic. It's a fantastic presentation on our courageous pioneer families. Can't even imagine moving here and living raw off the land. It's a beautiful tribute to the families that have done this amazing trek in our history. I love the fact that we've had a tour of this beautiful facility. Can't wait to come and visit. I do want to say a big thank you to Rob and to Don. Don, of course, is our club's resident historian. So, of course, he's a national treasure as far as I'm concerned. The man just keeps us in stories all along. It's wonderful. John, we haven't had the pleasure of really being able to spend any time with you. I'd like to invite you on behalf of the Italian Club to come and join us for a dinner. You can be part of our big Italian wedding dinner that goes crazy. Hopefully we can serve some Sovereign Opal wine. That would be lovely. I just want to say that these kind of presentations allow the KCIC to help preserve our heritage. You know, we've really worked hard in the last 5 years in trying to preserve our history and to make sure that generations to come understand where they came from. So things like this are super important to us, and we're so pleased to have you as part of the program. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Roseanne. On my behalf, thank you to Jen and Rob and Don. You guys hit it out of the park. And last time on this, we kind of did, we tried something and it worked pretty well. So if I could ask the whole audience to unmute yourselves and just give these guys a round of applause. It'll be kind of like we're all in the same room. So please do that.
Yay. Yay.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone. That was beautiful.
Yes, it was beautiful. And thank you. Have a good evening, everyone. And remember, join us on April 13th for the story of women coming to Pier 21. Good evening. Buonasera.
How do we say good night in Italian?
Buonasera.
Buonasera.